When mutants are continuously discriminated in a society that does not like mutants, that fears mutants and their powers, we think that the mutant community can no longer stand by. It has to make a stand. It needs to protect their young mutants. Coming from opening government, we're going to prove to you a few things, right? Our stance is simple. We think that under this model, you provide better protection for these young mutants, you provide a better upbringing for these mutants, and we think that you eventually create a safer society for both mutants and non-mutants, which will improve the interaction considerably. It is not our burden to prove that discrimination is going to disappear overnight, although we do think that that discrimination will be significantly lessened, and we think it's highly likely under our model. What is our model? We have a 4-point model. Firstly, the info slide says that the mutants' power manifests themselves when they're like early teenagers or whatever, right? But we don't really care. Whenever these powers manifest, we think that Charles Xavier will be able to use that funky headgear he has to detect these mutants, find them, and bring them in. Secondly, we think that even under status quo, when these mutant powers do manifest themselves, Charles and the X-Men constantly ask these parents to send their children to Charles' school for the mutants, right? If these parents agree to it, we think that's great. We're going to kidnap them without the parents' consent, because we think it's absolutely necessary. Secondly, we think that parents are going to know that the child gets kidnapped, right? So we're going to tell the parents, and we are going to allow the parents to visit the child. However, we're not going to allow the parents to take the child away. Thirdly, if the child runs away, or if other people kidnap the child, whatever, right? This is very simple. We're going to take them back. Okay, I think there's no question about the model. I have 3 points of substantiation for you today. Firstly, why is there such a dire necessity that justifies us doing this? Secondly, why is it that this school provides a better environment and a better upbringing for these mutants? And thirdly, how bringing them to this school will create safer mutants because you teach them how to use their powers properly as well. Firstly, before I go into it,
How does your policy result in the assimilation between mutants and non-mutants in the future?
We think that under our policy, right, when under status quo, when mutants are constantly feared, constantly discriminated against, we think that when you do bring them together and you teach them how, society will then know that these people are there, society know that these people are not such a threat, this fear will decrease, discrimination will decrease proportionally. We don't think that's a problem. Firstly, why is there such a dire necessity? Let's characterize the status quo properly, right? We think that mutants are discriminated in society. Why? Because people fear their power. Because there are cases where mutants lose control of their powers and they do hurt certain members of the public. We think that because of this, people fear the mutants. Even the parents fear the mutant child that has strange powers, right? We think that because of this sort of discrimination, it even makes mutants afraid of themselves. And because there's such fear, then they're less likely to be able to control their powers and more likely to lose control and hurt other people. Because of this such fear, people discriminate irrationally against these mutants. People constantly think that these mutants are out to get them, even if this is not the case. But even though these fears are somewhat justified, right, it doesn't matter what power you have. These people will still demonize you. People have hate speech against you, might even attempt to kill you. We think these are extremely harmful things against mutants, and we on track government need to protect them. We need to do something regardless of what others says. We think the end justifies the mean. The mutant community cannot stand by and watch their young ones suffer. Secondly, why do we think that when these mutants are brought to this school, that they will get a better upbringing and environment to do so? Because firstly, they'll be together with other mutants, right? There's a mutual understanding between mutants and mutants that will never be gotten from normal human society. We think in these sort of environments, where it's free from discrimination, where it's free from isolation and oppression, it's much more likely when these children, especially since they're still children, right, they're still rational and don't really understand things, it's much more likely they'll be able to understand and get a better upbringing, rather than the status quo where they're constantly discriminated. Under this policy, we prevent them of feeling isolated and discriminated. We say that this sort of feelings of isolation and discrimination are the ones that turn them into society, turn them against society at the end of the day, and it's going to harm the interaction on their side even. Furthermore, we think that under our policy, they can even get a normal education, such as they're not going to get under status quo. Because under status quo, when they're demonized even in school, they're not able to get education. And at the end of the day, when normal people have better education than these mutants, people discriminate even more against these mutants because they think that it's some of the fault of these mutants that they didn't get a proper education. And we think that when they do get education, they're much more likely to be able to relate because they understand things better. We think in the future, it will also lead to much better relations because there's constant improvement and integration, and it's much more likely to happen when children have good upbringing than in status quo, when children are discriminated and isolated in society, when children with these kinds of childhood, right, they grow up, they're not going to be able to relate well with human and other humans in society. We think that's harmful. We think you provide much better upbringing under this policy. So we think that mutants are much better off being kidnapped than they are being left alone. Therefore, we should kidnap them. Before I go into my third argument, sure.
What is the justification as to when you can override the parental consent over the child, whether or not the child actually wants to be free?
We think that the justification is very simple. When there's a harm to the child, and we've proven you this harm, is that the parents themselves discriminate against the mutant. That's what makes it even worse under status quo. That's why we need to kidnap them, right? Our third point is this, that the school will be more likely to be able to better help develop and control this mutant child's powers. Why? Because there are many experienced mutants over there. There's Charles Xavier, right? There's also the Cyclops. There's also people like Wolverine, who themselves have gone through the same discrimination from since young, right? So they understand what this child is going through. Furthermore, because these mutants themselves have power, that through the process that they learn to control their own power, they can use this knowledge to help these mutants control their power as well. We think that because the unchecked power in this young and unstable mutant is what is a threat to society, under our model, you make society safer because this mutant will be learned to control their power, will not lose control and might accidentally hurt some people in society, which is the entire source of the discrimination, right? Why we think it's so harmful without this? Because in the environment of isolation and discrimination, it's much less likely that these mutants will be able to control their power. It's more likely that they will lose control and might hurt a member of the public. We think that when that does happen, you further the discrimination and isolation against mutants. We inside opening government protect these mutants from discrimination and isolation. We provide a better environment for them for their upbringing. We provide a safer society where mutants can control their power properly. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to propose. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Mr. for the remarks. I'll consider the opposition to the opposition case.
If I have a moment and I face constant discrimination in a patriarchal society, the feminist movement will kidnap me, give me information, I'll be secluded from the patriarchal society, not knowing how to react once I get out of the situation. That is the model that exists within opening government, which is going to happen to the mutants. We think we don't want to do that. The problem is that the culture shock that exists within mutants when they come out, they're not going to stay in that school for the rest of their lives. They're not going to be robots. These are the kinds of problems that exist in opening government's case. They never do so. That's a convenient case that they set up, but we're still going to engage with it anyway. Few responses to their two arguments. Number one, what is the dire necessity? Because in order to prove a dire necessity, they are kidnapping individuals without the consent of parents. They need to justify why that justification of overriding consent is legitimate. The answer to my POI was, oh, because they face discrimination. The problem with this is, not every circumstance or not every parent discriminates the mutant the exact same way. You can't assume they all face the same problem, thus putting them into all one solution. Second question, whether provides a better environment for these individuals. Three things. Number one, not necessarily. What about mutants who still want to live within a society that just doesn't consist of only mutants to begin with? They don't have a choice because they be constantly enrolled that you are only a mutant, you must be a mutant, you cannot be anyone else. But second thing is, if education is such a problem and if parents face the problem of education, the parents can always, with consent, naturally enroll them into Charles Xavier schools. For example, Rogue or Jean Grey that got education through methods like this. But the third thing, and most importantly, is that not all parents discriminate these children. There are also parents who are actively happy with the fact that their child is a mutant to begin with. Under this model, you take them away from the special relationship that they could have with their child. That is destroyed because you all victimize them and homogenize every single individual into one party. But before that, yeah, sure, sorry.
Sir, do you then concede that there's a form of negligence when these parents know that their children are going to constantly get discriminated, and when there is an alternative to solve this discrimination and to protect the child,
sure.
why do you don't?
Under our model, we will harm a few mutants at the end of the day because sure, some will not be able to escape that cycle of discrimination. But a majority of people who have the ability to consent is what we're prioritizing because that is what most cases are in. That's why we're going to explain it because that's important. 4 arguments for you. Number 1, why this policy is a culture shock for the mutant to begin with. First level of analysis. What happens under their model? Because in these circumstances, they don't know what's going on with them. They don't know how they are. They don't know who they are. They don't know who is around them besides that wall that is that castle that they live in. They only know one thing, and there are no practical exercises as to how they react with any average human being. What do they do in these circumstances? Second level of analysis. Why is this harmful? 3 things. Number 1, they will react negatively if at all they come into contact with a human being because they don't understand the idea of what a human being does, how a human being functions, what should I do when I interact with a human being because I'm usually with mutants to begin with. This is harmful because the probability of them acting negatively with their powers is dangerous because you could cause damage towards humans who never intended to cause harm to begin with. If a human just shrugs and nudges a mutant, the mutant might just blast his head off. These are the kinds of things that exist because they don't understand human psyche. We think it's dangerous. Sure, you can give them information on how humans react, but it's never enough to have practical exercises because they don't have the interaction, they don't have experience. Secondly, you confuse these individuals. You victimize their minds because they don't understand what's going on. But the third and most important idea is that the X-Men would most probably try their very best to avoid the child from getting out. This is worse because you increase the curiosity that exists within the child will want to get out more and more and more. This is bad because when the child finally succeeds, all those harms that come will be duplicated because the child doesn't know what is going on after I've gone this far. Second argument, how you further separate the divide between mutants and humans. First level of analysis, because in these circumstances, now humans will hate the mutants even more because they're using immoral methods in order to achieve their goal. In these circumstances, they're doing things that are illegal by human standards, like kidnapping in these circumstances. If you want peace, you need similarities. When it comes to similarities, it means similarities with methods, i.e. they both work together to save victims in these circumstances, which they've been doing for a long period of time. Now you entrench the entire idea of them helping because they do something that is of complete difference. Because the government thinks you're terrorists, you think humans are weak. That's the divide that exists. Secondly, you humans will clump all mutants into one. X-Men and violent members of the mutant race is 2 different things, right? Magneto, like, what's his name? Xavier, right? In these circumstances, humans will assume that they are all evil and they'll all clump into one group of society that will never do. Why is this bad? Because all the values that they have for X-Men trying to propagate will never be credited or will never be recognized by the human race. Still want to save people at the end of the day. This is harmful. Third level of analysis. The mutants will never try to learn from the culture shock because it harms assimilation as a whole. You can never get into a society when you don't know how to react within a society, right? When in Rome, do what the Romans do. In these circumstances, they will react negatively. We think it's bad. But the last level of analysis to this argument is that they have to forever hide in that castle. This is worse because it is an easier target for A, governments to attack them, or B, for violent mutants to attack them because they only have to stay within that block or within that castle. They will never go out. There's no plan because they're stuck there. The second level of analysis is that they're never ever exposed. Third argument, that consent is never viable. And this is parental responsibility because they have rights and you can never assume on their behalf what will be the best interest of their child because all mutants are different. Sure, we might not be able to protect, but that's the trade-off we're willing to take because most individuals on the outside will be protected when they consent into being enrolled in this environment. Under their model, second level of analysis, it comes to trauma because you're separated from that child that you may have loved in the first place. This is even worse because under their model, you can have conjugal visits on their side, but you can never take the child away. So you conjugal on their side, but you can never take the child away. You will look at him for a period of time and know that my child is in a prison. I can only watch as he suffers in the prison. Maybe he didn't want it. We don't think that's beneficial to do so. That traumatizes parents that never wanted to be part of this equation to begin with. We think this is unfair victimization of parents who are not part of the equation. Third level of analysis, it harms the goal of X-Men because number 1, they are hated and primarily hated now because they're using illegal and immoral methods to do so. Because the primary support that they got is that from parents who actually wanted to legitimize this action. Now you don't have parental support anymore who actually want to enroll their children to begin with. Everyone hates you. But now you're not the X-Men anymore. You're the fake X-Men, the evil X-Men that somehow turned vigilante because of these actions. The last argument on the fourth argument on how there is no altruism once this child becomes an X-Men soldier. Why? Because number one, they become robots and they only taught to do one thing. In these circumstances, if Xavier tells me to stop that guy from shooting down the building, I will only do that. But if I see a child on the floor crying because I don't understand what a child can do, I will never have an incentive to save that child from the situations because I'm a robot now and never ever did so. When X-Men went to experiences, when they knew what fear felt like, when they knew what discrimination felt like, they have a natural incentive to react and protect people who are already discriminated within status quo. These are the levels of experience that any X-Men has. When you make them robots, they don't have the capacity to make other altruistic values besides fulfilling their missions. This is bad because at the end of the day, X-Men also have to do things that are altruistic in nature. If they don't do that, you are not the real X-Men to do so. For all those reasons, if you want a child to become a child that can consent into his actions, we don't want to victimize parents, we don't want to victimize the entire X-Men race as a whole.
A very accusatory and very assumptuous speech coming from Roshan, whereby he never told you the logical leaps with a lot of his arguments that he tried to sell the house. Mr. Speaker, we need to first analyze their characterization, because they told us that the majority of people are necessarily happy that their children are different, that the majority of people are necessarily happy that their children constantly get discriminated on the ground. Parents love their children for that very reason. We think that that's quite crazy, right? They made this very big claim that we never justified why it's important to override the role of the parent and the parents' rights as a whole. We need to analyze this, right? We need to look at this, right? Because we need to view that there is a spectrum of parents. Sure, there are parents that do accept their child for who the child is, right? But there are also parents who actively discriminate against their children, actively hate their children, and actively try to change their children, and actively try to make their children be someone that they aren't actually. We think that is very, very harmful, right? Because the first level of rebuttal, the first level of justification to that is this. We think that there are parents who are actively harming their children directly, right? I.e., they force their children to not show their powers, they force their children to continuously hide themselves from society, or they force their children to be someone they aren't as they are not necessarily are. We think that that's very, very harmful. But the second level of rebuttal is this. We think that it's already a form of abuse when the parents know that their children, the moment they go back into society, the moment they enter society, or the moment they interact with other individuals, they will get discriminated. We think that because of this information that these parents have, we think it's very, very harmful that the parents chose not to protect the child, but chose to further entrench that discrimination as a whole. We think that that's very, very harmful under their side. We think that is perfectly justified why the state does have the right to do that. Because the moment that we think that the state has that objective view of what necessarily is beneficial for the child, right? We think that the state must be there to tell the parents that, look, your child is in danger, we are here to protect you. We think that that is important. Let us move on to their arguments, right? Because the main bulk of his entire speech was the idea of interaction. That, oh, you know, the moment you enter into society from this big castle in the sky, you have a boom culture shock. Well, the first level of response to that is this: we'd rather them have a culture shock when they are adults, when they are able to handle such a culture shock in the first place, than them going to society as children and actively being discriminated by the people on the ground. We think that is much better if these individuals are integrated in society when they are adults, when they're best able to handle the situation on the ground, when they're better to assess the situation on the ground. We think that that is very, very important. But secondly, we must understand what status quo is, Mr. Speaker. We need to understand that the characterization from Taijie still stands, that these mutants and humans have a super difficult time in interacting because of irrational fears, because of all these other things that Taijie tried to bring up. We don't think that the idea of interaction can ever exist under Roshan's paradigm. Why so? Now he is forcing children who are unable to A, defend themselves, and B, explain who they are in the first place, to be able to achieve such interaction, to make society automatically accept them for who they are. We think that that is very, very harmful under Roshan's side. The next idea of curiosity, whereby he told us that, oh, you know, these children are going to be curious because they are being locked up in this castle in the sky. Well, this curiosity is very, very easily solved. You tell the child, look, if you go into society, you will get harmed. Children are able to access pain, they are able to access when they are being hurt. We think that this is sufficient enough to balance out the idea of curiosity that he tried to bring up. Next, the idea of clumping all mutants together. Well, we think that already happens in status quo. When the people on the ground homogenize all people, all mutants, to be bad people, we think that that's very, very harmful. But why does this happen, Mrs. Speaker? This happens because of one or two individual cases whereby mutants show their powers irrationally, whereby they are able to control their powers. But we think that the only way you can solve this is by putting them in a community whereby you are able to develop their powers, whereby you'll be able to teach them how to control their powers. The moment you remove the irrational fear that society has, you remove that homogenization of these X-Men, of these mutants. We think that that is very, very harmful. But the second level of rebuttal to that is this: because these mutants are being integrated in society at such a rough stage, right? We think that you affect their psyche as a whole. You make these people hate the humans, right? This is how you have people like Magneto who feel that there is never any chance that the mutants and the humans are going to interact. This is when you change their very psyche, when you put them all in the community together, when you teach them that, look, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It is important to recognize that this form of argumentation that Roshan trying to bring up doesn't necessarily stand. Lastly, the idea of, oh, you know, X-Men won't necessarily get support from the parents, and the altruism won't necessarily fail. We think that, number one, we are perfectly okay with altruism that isn't necessarily altruistic nature. Why so? Because if there's a marginal benefit that we are able to prove to you and show to the House, we think that altruism doesn't necessarily stand, right? Because number one, you are now dependent on mutants who do necessarily have that love towards human beings. We aren't necessarily removing that, right, Mr. Speaker? We are just putting them all in the community whereby they are still able to function together, right? But number two, the moment you accuse this, we don't think that Charles Xavier's school is a form of a military boot camp, whereby they go in, they brainwash and come out as robots to fight the battle of good, right? We think that's very, very harmful to make that assumption, because you have to understand that mutants are human in nature. But the harm is this, that humans don't think that they are human. You need to recognize that these mutants are able to interact, but the society continuously rejects them. This is the harm, and we are going to protect them. Sure.
Why is it better you victimize the safety of many individuals outside because the probability of them reacting and killing a person is dangerous? Isn't that bad?
We don't think that that's necessarily bad when you remove that harm to begin with. When you put all these mutants within a community where they are able to function, right? We think that this is important. Let us move on to the main argumentation that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk to you about the power in numbers, right? Why is it important to continuously put these individuals in there, right? We think it's important because mutants are the minorities, right? You will have to recognize that there are not many mutants in status quo, right? And the problem is that with that is this: they feel that they are alone. We think that the harm of that is this: you reduce the further interaction with people because they feel that they are no longer the same as humans. They are no longer able to be functional in society. But what do we mean by functional, right? Because now they are continuously believe that they are the bad actors in society. We think that this is harmful because now you are the ones that don't necessarily want them to be able to interact, right? Because they feel that they are alone. What happens when you put them all together collectively? You then make these individuals know that they are no longer alone, right? We think that this is important. Why? For twofold. The first fold, you are able to allow these individuals to interact the way they should have, to interact the way that children should have, to interact the way that normal individuals in society should do, right? But secondly, you provide this better stance towards these individuals to want to fight against that discrimination in the first place. Now that they are together, there's a power in numbers. These individuals are able to make organized stances towards that certain cause. We fight for the mutants. We want to protect them.
When we kidnap children, we steal choice. The X-Men aren't kidnappers, they're saviors. Saviors for people that choose to accept themselves. Savior for cause that accepts human choice. This is not the X-Men. Firstly, before moving on to the two substantive contribution, there are a lot of rebuttals there, so I can't cut. So, the first issue of rebuttal. And why is it important to override the rights of parents? Firstly, his main reason was parents hate children.
Well, there are three responses. One, there's a very minimal amount of parents still, because you take into account most of the students in the Xavier University are enrolled by the parents. If they are enrolled, that means the majority of parents did want to send them there because they could recognize they get a better form of help here. But even still, the second response, if they really do hate the kids, then we talk to them. Professor Xavier, an example being, he talked to Jean Gray's parents before they enrolled her in university because they recognized that she needed an extra incentive. But the third level, and if there really is no hope and parents will never change their mind, then the child needs to come to us themselves. But take into account it's a choice of the child. We cannot choose for him. We can't assume this is what the child wants to live as. Therefore, choice is important. You forget about the choice. So thank you. But the second level rebuttal on culture shock, he said that at least they're not discriminated. Well, mutants eventually have to learn to deal with it because you can never stop discrimination no matter how you try. Therefore, the question becomes, how do you best deal with discrimination? In your side, you don't understand what discrimination is. Therefore, when they enter into a real world and they're faced with discrimination, they are unprepared, they will deal with it irrationally. At least mutants who have dealt with it since they were young know how to control, they know how to act around normal people who aren't normal with them or don't accept them. No, thank you. But second, under this, she went on to explain, curiosity. Sure, but curiosity killed the cat. They won't know to what extent as to how they can go and how they can research. Therefore, if you give them too much control, too much space, they can still abuse it. You still don't control them fully. But third thing, on homogenization always happens eventually. That they will eventually come to us. Wrong. We have a differentiation of mutants because mutants are still people. Every mutant wants to live a life as an X-Men, wants to live a life as a mutant. Some even hide in secrecy because they want to live normal lives as people or individuals. Therefore, they don't want to be homogenized into your group. What you do is you force them from childbirth, you steal the choice. Decide they are kidnapped. You kidnappers. But then, lastly, on his thing, that there's no altruism because we don't care. Yeah, very dismissive. But even still, even if you said we're not a boot camp, but his extension was power in numbers. Yes, thank you. Sit down. No, thank you. He said they cannot function in society. Yes, they can function in society. Same way as discrimination always occurs. We don't say, oh my God, I'm discriminated and die. What we do is we learn to overcome the discrimination and we work towards dealing with that. What you're doing is you're running away from the problem. These mutants are never going to face it, and because they don't face it, they will constantly be scared. Your mutants are going for equality, they're going to be scared. But even still, some are afraid to be in those numbers. They don't want to be. Therefore, we don't care if you have power in numbers. If you don't want to conscribe to your numbers, so be it. Before I move on to my substantive contribution, sure.
So you don't have to prove to us why children are best able to handle this discrimination, right? And we think that the choice is limited the moment you are actively harmed. We don't think that we are willing to sacrifice those individuals that want to be humans, because collectively, we think that the harms are way worse on your side.
Children are going to face discrimination from people. Yes, we agree. Therefore, these children aren't going to be able to constantly run away from it. What they do is they deal with the discrimination and take into account. Parents also recognize when discrimination happens. That's why parents enroll them in this college or in this place that they want. No, thank you. What happens is you're only going to run away from discrimination. You don't stop it. You don't change it. You're not protecting the child anyway. My first substantive on why you create a risk of abuse. Who are these children? They are unaware of anything else because they've been stripped of a childhood and experience. Their life has been predestined and planned out for them from birth by these X-Men. Therefore, they cannot experience the problem of discrimination. What does this then make the child? It makes him three things. One, either he's completely indoctrinated. He only thinks the only existence is being an X-Man, being a mutant. Therefore, he's only been exposed to one life, closed-minded. Second thing is, he's confused. He's unsure as to what reality actually is. Is it maybe just confined to these walls, or is there something outside, something I yearn to seek? But third thing is rebelliousness. That is basic human nature. If you keep someone since childhood, when it comes to teenagers, they rebel because you keep them since childhood, so it's harder to control. Therefore, they will use your kidnapping to fuel their rebelliousness. Now they think that you are the ones at fault because you didn't give me the choice. My choice and ability was restricted by your thing. An example is a mutant known as Pyro. Pyro is a teenager who rebels against everyone else, reason being people told him there's only one way to live, either be an X-Man or die a hero. Another example is Rogue. Rogue was an X-Men too, but he almost went evil and even joined Magneto for a certain amount of time because Professor Xavier's constant indoctrination. This is what happens when you're overbearing. But the second question under this, why will this lead to an abuse of these children? Given that now you create extremely powerful mutants since childhood, you weaponize them in fact, you will attract violent mutants to recruit them. How do you make it easier for the recruitment of these people? No, thank you. For two things. One, you can capitalize on the inner turmoil. Magneto preys on this. This is how he gets even more mutants. Now when you're confused about whether you should be an X-Men or you should go out there and explore, Magneto will give you those benefits. He tells you it's life where no one can control you. You're in control of what you want. You can choose. Therefore, he'll make you abuse that choice and you become evil himself. You're recruited to doing evil things. But the second reason being is when Magneto or a violent mutant tells you that your entire childhood is taken away from you by the X-Men, you're not going to love them for doing that. Instead, it fosters a hate or you want to separate yourself from them. That's why you might leave. But the third question on why is this harmful? Because either he goes rogue and is extremely powerful, or two, he stays in between. Now you have no control regulation over what he does. He's just someone who can do whatever he wants. What should be the proper way then? You should allow them to make the decision for themselves. But if they really do want to be a mutant, be an X-Men, then they will choose. An example being, like in X-Men, the in X-Men First Class, on the beach, many chose to leave with Magneto when given the choice. Therefore, if they don't recognize the choice exists, they might abuse the choice, and something you can't control will happen. But the second substantive, why isn't this an exact action that should be taken by X-Men specifically? But the first question is, what the goals of the X-Men? To foster mutants who seek for help. They respect humans as people. Why is it against the principles of the X-Men? Because the first reason, by kidnapping them, it's a form of force. Now these mutants didn't come towards you and seek your guidance, instead you force them to come towards you. It's not what Professor Xavier wanted, of course you kidnap them, I guess it is, but it's not really what you're supposed to do as the X-Men. You don't guide them, you don't teach them, you force them to accept your guidance and your teaching. But the second reason is, you don't even take the parents' rights into account, you don't respect humans, you don't respect your equality. That's why you're acting out of line, you're acting unfairly. For all those reasons, don't kidnap children. Thank you.
Three unique extensions coming from CG today, and it's all going to fall in line on the impacts upon the mutants if they're not taken away. Number one, why they'll get experimented on and why that's harmful. Number two, how they'll be recruited by enemy mutants and why that's harmful as well. How do we these are okay with that, but let's extend our case. In our case, we'll prove the necessity on why we need to do this and why it's extremely crucial. If not, the mutant race and society as well will go into turmoil. Before that, a few levels of rebuttals towards what OG said. Firstly, react negatively when they're with humans and don't have a culture shock. Culture shock because they don't know how to react to discrimination. They already know what discrimination is. That's why they're in the school in the first place. X-Men won't intend to isolate themselves, right? This is extremely false, right? X-Men always trust themselves into the public sphere, and a perfect example of this is Beast, right? Beast is a political ambassador for the X-Men in of itself, right? But furthermore, X-Men always educates mutants to control their powers and only use it when it's necessary, so you don't think there will be negative reactions when they see humans at all. Second rebuttal, humans will hate mutants more, they do all these because mutants do illegal stuff and things like that, right? Humans already homogenize mutants into they don't have a dichotomy, right? They see all mutants as the same. That's why they don't see a difference between Magneto and they don't see a difference between Charles Xavier as well. So the argument is value neutral, right? But let's extend this even further, right? Our side provides that dichotomy that when we tell them we'll bring them into a school, and although by kidnapping by force, but at least we allow them visitation rights and stuff like that, right? And allow integration. But furthermore, right, we allow them to understand the dichotomy that we're not teaching them to harm you. We're teaching them how to be mutants to understand mutants more. Then furthermore, they try to tell you that you make mutants robot and no longer altruistic. No, Charles Xavier cannot have total impunity and control over all mutants. That's the first thing we need to understand, right? Because mutants have their own feelings and it's not only controlled by Charles Xavier. So what Charles Xavier incentive here, right? Charles Xavier has incentive to teach mutants to protect humans by themselves by altruistic means, right? Because only the enemy, only Magneto's mutants intend to make them robots, right? So that's the dichotomy, right? X-Men mutants can only counter the idea that the enemies are robots by making them do altruistic actions in the first place. So X-Men will protect innocent lives in schools and things like that. All seen throughout all 3 movies or all 6 movies, depends on which series you follow. No, I'll tackle Sid's case now, right? Strip of childhood experience. We don't think X-Men strips you of childhood experience. In fact, they've always prioritized the enjoyment of your childhood, right? That's why they allow Rogue and Bobby to go on their dating scenes and not always focus upon training them to be militants and stuff like that, right? But the reason why X-Men has to teach military tactics is because of the protection of the mutants themselves, right? We think it's extremely crucial to begin with, right? right? We have to change the incentives, and only our side, when we counter the necessity that we have to protect ourselves first, that's the only way we can change the incentive to allow you to enjoy your childhood and think aside. I'll tackle you guys later. Let me finish the rebuttals. Lastly, against the goals of mutants, I'll prove to you in my speech today why it's in line with the goals of X-Men in the first place. To firstly prioritize their survivability in the first place, but secondly, then only focus on things like enjoying your childhood and things of the such. Therefore, we don't think like the idea at the end of the day is correct. But lastly, on this weird idea that Magneto will give you benefits and you subscribe with them, we only think that Magneto will kidnap you in the first place. That's why it's harmful. But if you intend to flock with them at the end of the day, those are choices you make, not because the X-Men oppress you, because you are not in line with the goals of X-Men, and therefore X-Men has to change its goals in the first place and things of such. I'll prove to you. I'll extend this further in my speech. I'll take Amrit.
Sir, tell me how inside government are you going to humanize these mutants to use their powers in a way that manifests human ability in a better way?
Human ability? No, we want, like, I already made it very clear why it's necessary to kidnap these mutants first, right? We need to prioritize survivability first, and we need to counter the enemy's opportunity to kidnap these children and take them into their enemy lines first, right? We think the idea that you can prioritize human things or all the such can come later after we prove that discrimination is no longer there. We prove that you can survive on your own. Those are things that we can prioritize later. Let's go into my speech, right? Firstly, the impact upon if the mutants are not taken away by Charles Xavier. Firstly, they'll be experimented upon, right? Why is this so? They'll be taken away upon discovering that, upon the parents or upon individuals discovering that they're mutants, they'll be taken away by private military corporations as seen in the movies and tested on to create sentinels, right? These tests are extremely excruciating, torturous. They cut off your wings, they cut off your limbs to conduct these tests, right? So these things harm mutants as individuals in and of itself, right? There's physical and psychological trauma related to this, and the harm upon the individual mutant themselves is irreversible because it may potentially lead to death, it may potentially lead to you not having your powers anymore. But the second harm is this, right? It harms mutants as a race of itself because the experiments are used to create sentinels, right? These are undefeatable robots. They are able to adapt to mutant powers in order to neutralize mutants themselves, right? Sentinels are used to annihilate these mutants, and mutants face inevitable extinction with these sentinels being created. But thirdly, is the harm to society, right? The reason why Magneto and Mystique want to fight against humans is because of this experimentation which torture their brothers and sisters. They feel bloodthirsty and rage when they want to avenge their brothers and sisters of the same race, of the same cause. This is when we wreak havoc against humans and kill innocent lives, right? We change this calculus when we take the first preemptive measure and kidnap them first. No, I'll let that to you later. It's so, right? Secondly, how they'll be recruited by enemy mutants, right? Enemy mutants also intend to build their own army. It's not good, but they're not for doing things for good, they're doing things to antagonize humans, right? These are mutants who don't care about diplomacy. They indoctrinate these child mutants and brainwash them as child mutants to antagonize humans because those are the reasons why you are discriminated in today's society, right? It's hard to change these mutants once we reclaim them back from the enemy in and of itself. A perfect example is Mystique, right? It was hard to change her calculus to join Charles Xavier back after she joined with Magneto, right? So we have to take the preemptive measure and prevent war and chaos and prevent the enemy from building up their own army by taking the first step and proving that it's necessary to take away the child first and indoctrinating them with the right things to protect humanity. No, lastly about closeted mutants, and that's why it's harmful towards OG's case, right? Because they don't know the idea and magnitude of their power when they're closeted and no one takes them in, right? They will react negatively when they find out about their powers because they don't know how to react upon finding out about their powers. This is when they go rogue and act as individuals without regard for the law. A perfect example of this is Gambit, right? Gambit cheats and harms innocent human beings without any regard for the law, and it's because he's rogue, it's because no one's there to indoctrinate and teach him the right things to do. So how are all these things in line with the goals of X-Men, right? Number one, we moderate these individuals through education. We allow them to control their powers and accept themselves in this case. But number two, integration, right? They allow for better cooperation with the state and society when we get all these mutants on our side and not on the enemy side, and we eliminate the discrimination because we destroy the Sentinel project, right? We destroy the idea that Sentinels can be built by kidnapping these mutants first and taking that preemptive measure. But thirdly, we counter the enemy mutants because we have more numbers now. We have better bargaining power in this situation. We are better able to neutralize them under this situation with more enemy power, with more mutants. We think our side is the only side which protects humans as a race. We can prioritize things like humanity and things of the such. Later, we must prioritize survivability first. Only our side prioritizes survivability.
Calm down, Aish. Okay. human beings and mutants are not different. We think they have different advantages, that we claim them different niches within society. But we think the point at which you isolate them, we think you create a superiority complex that removes our ability to humanize mutants and mutify humans. We think that is what closing opposition will do in this debate. We think there's a very clear line when we think humanity must be the decisive principle that governs mutants and governs human beings per se. We think the point at which you isolate mutants from status quo is when we think you lose the ability for us to manifest the best things we can for mutants. Things like benefiting from their abilities, benefiting from their advantages, but also systematically clamping down on the advantages that could harm human beings. That's why we think I've got 3 extensions. First of all, we're going to talk to you about how human beings are able to benefit from mutants' specific abilities. Second of all, I'm going to talk to you about how mutants are going to be able to learn from human elements and human flaws. Third of all, I'm going to talk to you about if you make this a legitimate tactic, we think Magneto will be the first person to do this, and that will empower the radical movement, because we think Magneto is much stronger than Charles Xavier. And fourth of all, I'm going to talk to you about human superiority and why we think that radicalizes human beings to the ground to not involve individuals in diplomatic processes and all these other things that make you human being and make you count in society. But before that, let's go through a few rebuttals to his extension. First of all, his extension wanted to say that, well, we think Magneto is a person who is obviously going to try this tactic. We need to clamp down on him before he does this. First of all, we think the very exclusive ability that X-Men have is to say that we're going to protect you and we value your individual choice. First of all. Second of all, we think when you make this a legitimate tactic, we think Magneto will also garner his men to hurt people. So we think even if X-Men does not hurt people, Magneto will systematically hurt parents, will hurt anybody who opposes this case. So we think Magneto will have the upper hand if you legitimize this. Even. Second of all, he talked about experimentation, because he said private military corporations and human beings will obviously experiment on these mutants, because there's a marginal benefit to doing so. We have 4 rebuttals. Number 1, we think that only happens in the event where human beings don't recognize the humanity within mutants. The same way we oppose experimenting to prisoners and we oppose experimenting to other people within war is because we recognize, regardless of who they are, they're human beings at the end of the day. That can only come when you don't send a message to human beings that these people are superior, these people need to be clamped down, these are not human beings. But third of all, even if it's about sentinels, we think those are obviously violation of human rights, and we think those type of violations are never going to be supported by human beings. The same way when governments had the initiative within X-Men to inject the anti-serum and obviously render their ability nullified, human beings lobbied against it. We think there are human elements that exist. You remove that when you say that we should not respect them. We should tell human beings that you guys are the enemy. You make human beings the enemy, you lose the traction human beings have within status quo. But last of all, his last extension was about closeted mutants. First of all, we think we don't understand how that benefits your case. If somebody is closeted, we should respect his ability to be closeted. But second of all, people like Gambit joined the X-Men because they recognize there's a value. But third of all, even in the instances where Rogue joined the X-Men, he was persuaded by Magneto. You give Magneto the narrative within status quo because you say that we need to segregate human beings and mutants. You are endorsing that segregation. We think that's problematic. Let's deal with opening sit down. First of all, if it's about discrimination with parents, the same way we have laws that prevent parents from discriminating against LGBT children, is the laws will extend to these people. We can charge them with negligence if worse comes to worse. That is completely nullifying your discrimination law. But second of all, it's the debate about interaction. Because they said, what's the message they were going to send to these people? They said, yes, we'll teach you to control your abilities, we'll teach you to manifest your technology, your powers in a good manner. But we think that's not exclusive, because we think opening up obviously argued that we can send them to school. But what is the point of isolating them? So we think them learning their powers is something we can also achieve. But last of all, they also said that in this case, we will tell them and actively send them a message that you need to be in our community of individuals because we are protected by ourselves. The same way we told black individuals within the United States we need to segregate schools because we were somehow lesser than white people. We think, yes, there might initially be a backlash, but the point at which you desegregate schools is when you equalize the playing field. My extension. First of all, let's talk about the benefits this movement has. Because we recognize there are several benefits that make them not very human. What do I mean by not very human? I mean, for example, diamond skin. For example, the ability to move objects without touching them. The ability to read people's minds. Although we recognize those are legitimate things to do, we don't think those are in line with human principles. For example, the right to privacy. But second of all, from being completely oblivious to your enemy and all these other methods. We think when you allow mutants to feel that they're superior than human, this number one leads in the event where there's a mutant human war, which we think is an inevitable backlash of their side, we think you force mutants to use these methods in the most inhumane way, which means in status quo, if we draw distinctions between combatants and civilians, we will never be able to draw those distinctions because it's going to be an annihilation of the human race, not single out human as a whole. So we think that's problematic in the way they treat humans. But second of all, we think there are benefits to the mutant powers that we can assimilate, which means we obviously respect their integrity, but we think we're able to show them that you have benefits that we can accrue from. For example, the type of powers that they have. For example, the type of technology that they're able to invest in humanity. So we think those are things that develop the human field and the human capacity. But we think that only is able to achieve when there's an active role by these mutants, an active role for them to acknowledge their benefits that they can give to humans, and there's an active role in humans acknowledging that we can gain some form of traction. Yes, closing.
Yeah, Matt, we don't think that's mutually exclusive. Why can't Charles and Xavier teach them to do those things? Teach them to trust themselves in the public sphere and allow those integrations to happen?
See, here, this is the difference. We don't mind Charles Xavier teaching him. We have a problem with him sending a message that we must kidnap you from your human parents. We must isolate you from humanity in itself. So if you want education that can be achieved, it's about sending the message that human beings are so volatile that we can't even let you stay in the same house as them. Second extension, we also think this leads to human superiority being harmful. How so? If you can see there are people like the guy he said who was a diplomat within status quo, or they're able to integrate into society, it's because human beings recognize, even though they have some benefits that are not human beings, they're innately human. They innately have the ability to feel the same fear you have. They innately understand what's the importance of preserving your lives. So even if there's a goal behind killing you, we won't do so. We think that type of perception is important to integration of mutants. How so? 3 levels. Because first of all, we think that leads to better mutant rights. Because we think human rights only evolve when you recognize the distinction that we need to uphold. So we think that prevents the discrimination they talked about. But second of all, the power in numbers that opening government talked about will be further empowered on our side. Because we think, number one, it legitimizes their lobbying power. So we think with the political system, they'll be able to lobby for better type of rights. Because they're not seen as vindictive groups that are inherently different from human beings. But second of all, in a lot of cases where human superiority is nullified, we think these people have the ability to gain traction with human beings. So we think they're able to assimilate and create a better genesis of humanity as a whole. Because we think humanity is an ever-evolving concept that has to involve the benefits and the wrongs of these people. You isolate them is when you push them to annihilate the human race. We think we can never allow it to exist. We might as well gain a benefit from them.
Here, here.
You must understand something, that the world we live in today is already not very accepting of these mutants. That if side closing opposition or opening opposition wants to talk about how they can better work together with these humans, the only time that they work together is in Evans extension, where they experiment upon them, where they torture them in order to make weapons that ultimately annihilate all mutants for humans. There is nothing of that sort of assimilation that closing opposition tried to paint to you today. There are 3 issues that I'll talk to you about today. Firstly, on the idea that Evan brought to you about right? How they will be, what happens without the impacts without our proposal. On the second idea, on the idea of the superiority complex, and on this third idea of assimilation, right? Let's take a look at the first idea. On the impacts without this proposal, because there were 3 things, right, that I haven't talked to you about, and the only response we really heard was Magneto can do it too. Magneto can experiment on them. Magneto can kidnap them as well. But the point is this: that because Professor Xavier has cerebral, he has his mind powers, he can do it first, right? Even if their side, even if Magneto decides to do these things, we think he's already doing this. We think the experimentation is already happening upon them, and that's why the X-Men, it is within their objectives to do it now in order to protect them from later. Because their response on the idea of experimentation was pretty simple, right? That Sentinels violate their human rights and therefore they're not supported. But the thing is this: people think that Sentinels are protecting their human rights. People have been engineered in their minds to believe by these corporations, by these researchers, that Sentinels are necessary because mutants are necessarily a bad thing. And the problem in their side is this: you validate the claims that these mutants are not something that you should be okay with, because they never learn the control that you can only learn in Professor X's school. If they never They'll become things like Ro, right, where she sent her boyfriend into a coma for a year because she kissed him, right? It's because of this lack of control that people are afraid of them. It's because of this lack of control that you never get assimilation. But on his third idea of them being closeted, right? Later after this, okay? We didn't really hear much of a response to this, right? Because basically she told us, let them closet if they are good with being closeted. Look, that's not a response, okay? There's a lot of LGBT individuals who are closeted. Is that all right? We think that the goals that, however, that Evan brought to you today from the X-Men were never engaged on, right? What were these goals? First, to make them moderate, right? To make sure that they understand that their powers are to be used for good instead of being overridden by people like Magneto and rather antagonized towards humans. No, thank you. But the second and third, right, which were important, was that they cooperate with the state, right? They cooperate with the state to protect the people from other people. Right? With examples like the Beast, who even actively participates in Parliament, that they counter enemies, right? And this is that active participation that Amrit was looking for, and we think they never properly engaged on. But before I move on, yes, Roshan.
In days of future past, Mystic saved the president. That is a good action in itself. Your model to homogenize all mutants is bad, thus making Mystic need go unheard. Why is that in itself justified?
Look, okay, these mutants, they are already homogenized today because the dominant narrative is that they are bad. Because the dominant narrative is that there are less of these good mutants who are in the X school because none of their parents want to send them there. But let's look at that second idea where I'll tackle CO. No, thank you. All right. On the idea of a superiority complex, because there is no reconciliation of their humanity. That's not true, right? We think that Professor X never teaches them about necessarily superiority. If you look at a lot of the footage on his classes, it's simply about him wanting to teach them to love humans, to love them even if they hate you, even if they try to back you down, don't antagonize against them. And these kinds of lessons cannot be learned in the real world where they are antagonized towards the people who treat them badly, where because they don't know how to control their powers, they eventually lash out towards these people, thus validating the kinds of fears towards them. No, thank you. After this, we think the more than that, right? It's very selfish for them to claim that they feel superior, because there's a lot of mutants, right? People like Jean Grey, Charles Xavier, who lay down their lives because they knew that there was a threat towards humans, not just to mutants, right? There is no superiority complex here. We think that it's more like that. No, but we think that the message that really happens here is that survivability of these mutants, teaching them to be better, overrides all other rights. But on the second idea that Amri talked to you about, no, thank you, is the idea of integration, because you can lobby more and you're not seen as vindictive. But the problem is this: you're only seen as vindictive because you don't know how to control your purposes. You don't know, you're recruited by evil, and therefore your purpose becomes evil, right? Considering all of this, we think that it's more like that it's better that the X-Men does these kinds of things first, that we don't allow them to really think of that superiority complex, or when they are one mutant against 100 others, as opposed to us, right? We're in a school of mutants where they understand we are a community, but we are a community that seeks to serve the people. That's why we even have special jets so that we can fly all over the world to save them. But let's get the third idea. No, thank you, because this was because OO gave us 4 things, right? They told us firstly that there's some kind of a culture shock that happens, and there's no assimilation that happens here. Apart from that, there is no assimilation in status quo anyway. We think that discrimination at its root is a fear of the unknown, and this fear of the unknown is perpetuated, right? Because they cannot control their powers and they lash it out upon other people. We think that discrimination is never something that's easy to go with, and that's why you need to protect these people from it, especially when there's such a vulnerable point in their lives that they're developing. They're already growing to things like puberty, changing bodies, and you want them to deal with getting new powers that nobody else understands. We think that there won't be that much of a culture shock, right? But apart from the idea of that, right, we think that they're not exactly shut out from the world. Right? They still have things like TV. There's that boy who can change the TV channels. They still go outside to save the world, that kind of thing. We don't think that they have such a culture shock, right? Especially since they were brought up in the human world anyway. But on the second idea, right, on the second idea of consent, the problem is this: we think there's a bit of a concession that came out there, right? Because they told us that good parents do send their children to these schools, which means that all their harms of sending these children to the schools anyway are something that they still perpetuate as long as there was consent. We think that at the end of the day, we always override parental consent for the good of utilitarian benefits, right? And these utilitarian benefits not only are for the mutants, but also for humanity as a whole. But let's look at the third idea, right, of societal backlash and hatred. We think that this divide already exists, right? Especially since the mutant negatives are the dominant narrative here. Because people like Magneto, they seek to do a lot of things. They recruit a lot of evil people, and they like to go out on stampedes, on bombing other people or things like that, just because they want to exert, they want people to fear them by his exact words. Considering that, then we think this is a necessary counter narrative when we raise up an army of people who are good in order to counter this kind of thing. But on their fourth idea of rebellion, we gave us an example of Pyro. But look, the reason why these mutants would necessarily rebel is because an excessive interaction between them and the evil mutant. This is what happened, right? Pyro wasn't part of the X-Men. He was talking with Magneto. Magneto was able to draw him to the other side. And this is the kind of thing that side opposition perpetuates, right? Because Magneto is always on the lookout for new talent. Magneto, or even these experimental fellas, they're always on the lookout for more people that they can exploit, more people that they can turn to their side. X-Men need this kind of tool in order to, prevent these things at the get-go, right? In order, as opposed to just allowing them to become evil and then only try to change them, which is something that is just generally ineffective. Go with side, CG. We were the only side that decided to root out what actually caused discrimination to mutants. That you disregarded the human element of, these mutants. You isolate them from society, and you now make it a rat race to recruit all of these mutants, and either Magneto or the X-Men can recruit these mutants and push their ideals on them. When we've identified this root cause of discrimination, we're the only ones who are willing to solve it, because we're willing to put you there in society, and you'll have to experience human nature, experience why humans fear your powers, for you to be able to get a better control of them, for you to be able to understand why humans feel this way and why you are considered a threat, because only then will you be able to mitigate your powers, or will you be able to stop causing such fear among people. And that's exactly, that's the extension that was never engaged with on their side. But then let's go on into what closing tried to talk about. Because the main issue from their side is the first question: are these really the goals that are in line with the X-Men? And they tried to sit down and they tried to push these ideas that mutants are taken away for experimentation, they'll be indoctrinated, antagonize people, and they'll start going rogue. And this is the biggest contradiction on their side, because mutants are only taken away for experimentation when they pose a threat to society. Mystique was taken for experimentation because she killed the guy because he was a threat to people, and that's when they started taking active measures and drastic measures into starting to experiment on them. And that's when they see mutants as a threat, because they feel those mutants are superior. And because you're superior, you'll be able to act on that. That's why we want to take it away when we can allow mutants to integrate with people in society, so that they can have some moderate beliefs that they are one and the same. But then on how mutants will go rogue, and they bring up this example of like Gambit, because he'll go rogue and all of these people will start going rogue and he'll start being recruited. First of all, Gambit had felt like he started to feel that human element of even falling in love or even integrating with people by falling in love with Rogue, or even when he wanted to leave the Acolytes or leave his family behind. That's when he went to join the X-Men. That's how important the human element is to people who are in the threat of going rogue. And even then, like, if you're worried about all of these mutants who cannot integrate with people, and you bring up examples of Beast. Beast is a respected political representative because he shows that compassion that he feels for humans. He only shows that because he understands that what humans feel are fear for them. That's why he tries to push that we are not people who are supposed to be feared. We do respect humans. We do respect you enough to overcome that discrimination. Sit down. And then finally, like the last idea of the extension on how people like Jean Grey and Xavier are ready to lay down their arms, and that Sentinels are the only way that people will see that they can protect their own human rights. Look, we've already told you, this is because they feel that threat to their society, and this is because, and like mutants who are willing to side with humans only do so because they're compassionate enough to show that they're compassionate enough to protect people. You cannot say that just because mutants are still essentially human, now you isolate them, you don't allow them to feel whatever it is they feel with other people in that society, you don't allow them to understand that human element. And the very reason that mutants
Jean Grey or Xavier only feel that way because they went through that discrimination themselves. They went through what mutants, they went through why humans feared, and they're willing to overcome that. Sit down. And that you still cannot get enough exposure by watching TV, because that was their solution. You can get this exposure by watching TV and reading the news. It's not enough because they don't understand essentially they don't understand essentially the discrimination that they'll be feeling. They have to experience these human causes themselves. And when you isolate them, you make them lose this humanity, you make them lose this exposure. Sit down. Before I go on into the cases that came from opening, let's actually just prop up our extension, because it was very largely not dealt with on their side. And the most important part that Amrit had talked about was how this actually strengthens the cause for you to fight for mutant rights. Because now people will want to believe in these mutant rights when they see the human element in it. And beyond that, even when people can see the active discrimination that people are being punished just because you're mutants. Like even in status quo, there are people who are willing to protect these mutants. That's why government initiatives to be able to root out your X gene in X-Men 3, to root out those genes are still watered down because there are people willing to protect them. That's what strengthens mutant rights, because you can still, like, all that discrimination is essential for you to be able to push for something, for you to be able to push that these people deserve to be protected. It's the same reason that even black people or discriminated people get their rights in the first place, because all of this discrimination leads to you being targeted as the person who has to be protected. That's when you strengthen their rights in status quo, not by regarding them as irrelevant. I'll take you, wait. Oh, you're not sure, actually.
Okay, look, since you've already considered that discrimination is pervading society, engage with us on the idea that interaction with the human world, that you want to only antagonize them further to join the evil mutants.
No. See, if that were true, then all mutants who would be a part of the human world would always join acolytes, so would always join the brotherhood. That isn't what happens. People willingly are people willingly go to Xavier to control their powers. People willingly see the fear that humans also feel. All of these things don't exist just because they feel antagonized. They only feel antagonized, however, when men sit down. They only feel antagonized when you are raised in a society or you are raised among mutants that will only antagonize you. That's also the last extension that came from their side. Because now, if I can recruit you and put you in a society, like if I can recruit you and make you feel a certain way against humans, if I can recruit you and just tell you that these are what humans do to you, that's why I have to take you away from your parents and from the rest of society, that's what makes me actively more antagonistic against humans. That's when your side doesn't solve the problem of any antagonism. But the last issue from opening is that they want to remove, it's the idea of removing discrimination versus the right form of educating these mutants. And the right form of education only happens when you can make them feel those human elements. You can make them feel like compassion, and when you can start integrating them into society. All of these support structures exist for mutants where you can still become comfortable being a mutant. You still have the X-Men who are willing to root you out and help you with them. You still have other mutants who fight alongside humans that help you. You even have people on the ground who want to water down harmful government initiatives to help you. That's why there are all of these mitigating factors of teaching these mutants. Education isn't exclusive on their side, because we are always willing to educate people on the most important part of being a mutant, and that's in essence feeling the human element in protecting other people.
Yes, she has a reviewer.
You think mine?
She promised me, you haven't promised me.